at Barnard College Harriman Institute faculty member, and delighted to welcome you to today's event, the Geopolitics of Ukraine Ceasefire Talks. As always, we're convening this jointly with my partner, Josh Tucker. And today we have a stellar panel that has come together to discuss the latest events, sometimes which change day to day and even hour to hour, on what is happening both within Ukraine ceasefire talks and at various national levels of various sort of constituents, whether it's Ukraine itself, Moscow, Washington. And so we are have just like a wonderful group of experts today that Josh will introduce in a moment. Just a few words of introduction. This is part of our RPP series. Now, I believe in our ninth year, is generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So thank you to them. Thank you to you for joining us today at lunchtime. And stay tuned for additional webinars as we weigh in on these various issues of concern. The format today, Josh will talk about it, but if you do have a question, please use the Q&A and type your question in there. We'll get to questions after presentations of our speakers. So welcome once again. I'm really looking forward to learning from the insights of our speakers. And Josh, I'll hand it over to you to introduce today's panel.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks to all of you who are joining us today, both on YouTube and in the webinar. And again, the nice thing about the webinar format is you can ask questions at any time. You'll see I'm sure everyone's used to this by now. You see the Q&A button on the time. You're not interrupting the speakers or anything like that. So if a question pops into your head while one of them is talking, you feel free to ask anytime, or we can do it at the end after they've all spoken. As Alex said, we have a fantastic panel here today. I'm going to give very brief bios so we can get right to the information of each of them in succession when they're about to talk. And we'll have more extensive biographic information for them shared in the chat. So to kick us off today is Brian Taylor, who's a professor of political science and director of the Moynihan Institute of Global Affairs at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Brian?
Great. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Josh, for the invitation. Before I start, I did want to quote 5 colleagues from the Columbia Political Science Department and say that no private university can fulfill its mission while subject to government micromanagement and minute oversight of its research activities, internal governance, personnel matters, and curricular decisions. Columbia will remain the college of no kings. All right. Turning to the ceasefire negotiations, I want to make 2 points. First one is that Putin is not interested in peace or a deal. He is interested in victory. And second, even with the likely withdrawal of U.S. military support, victory for Putin is not on the horizon. So on the first point, Putin not interested in peace, interested in victory. I think it's pretty clear, at least I would argue, that he still wants the same thing that he's wanted for decades, and quite clearly since February 2022, which is Ukraine in some fashion under Russian control or Russian subjugation. Sometimes this is euphemistically referred to as a friendly Ukraine, friendly to Russia. And you see this in his frequent comments that any ceasefire and any peace deal has to eliminate the root causes as far as Russia is concerned of the conflict. So what does that mean concretely today? First of all, Putin wants formal recognition by other states, including the US and Ukraine, of its control over 5 territories that it has claimed that it has annexed. It does not have full control over 4 of those 5 territories, but they would claim their right to control the sort of current boundaries, internal boundaries of those regions, not just stopping at the current line of conflict. Second, neutrality for Ukraine. That means no NATO membership, no NATO troops deployed in Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire. Third, what they refer to as demilitarization, and he's referred to it that way again since the beginning of the war, which means radical cuts to the size of the Ukrainian military and to the type of equipment, including the number of tanks, long-range fires, and those sorts of things. So quite strict limits on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. Fourth, what Putin sometimes refers to and other Russian politicians sometimes refer to as denazification. What that means is Russian control over internal Ukrainian domestic political matters, such as language issues, the way history is taught, and so on. At the current time, that also includes an expectation on the Russian side that Ukraine will have new elections in the event of a ceasefire or peace settlement. They see Zelensky as illegitimate. I would guess Olga will have more to say on this matter. And recently, he even talked about sort of UN taking control over Ukrainian politics to administer an election. And fifth and finally, sanctions relief. Okay. He still insists that Russia didn't start the war, that it was started by the West. He still insists that a ceasefire would require an end to military assistance and intelligence assistance from the U.S. and other NATO member allies, and even restrictions on Ukrainian training and conscription. If you sort of are looking at the progress of the talks, they've been scaled back over the last 3 weeks, right? Initially, Trump was saying that he wants a complete ceasefire, which would include, land, sea, and air. Then the sort of land part of it went into the background. They were talking about ceasefires at air and at sea. Now they're talking about some airstrike limits, and there's a bit of a definitional issue. Is this energy? Is this infrastructure? Is it both? Is it energy infrastructure? Either way, no such ceasefire is actually in place and being observed. And then most recently, some fairly meaningless commitments at the naval level in exchange for sanctions rollback with respect to Russian agricultural exports. Zelensky has said Ukraine is willing to support a full ceasefire, but Putin clearly is not on board with that. But he, for obvious reasons, wants to continue to express interest in a settlement or a ceasefire to try and shift the blame for the eventual breakdown of these talks onto Zelensky, which I would say editorially is probably relatively easy to do, given the predispositions of Trump, but we'll have to wait and see how that develops. On the second point, on military matters and what would happen with the withdrawal of U.S. military support, even if that were to take place, which seems possible in the coming months, in certainly the coming year, I don't predict a massive change in the course of the battle. Putin was saying last weekend that our troops have the strategic initiative along the entire contact line. We have reason to believe we're set to finish them off. I don't think that's true at all. In DC over the winter, someone very expert on this matter was saying that Russia's on a roll, but it really looks to me like Russia's more on a crawl. They still don't control more than 75% of Donetsk region, Zaporizhia region, and Kherson region. And at their current rate of advance, it would take them a century to conquer the entire territory of Ukraine. This is happening at the time of really stunning losses on the battlefield, and the number of casualties in terms of dead and wounded continue to increase year by year from 2022 to 2023 to 2024. Estimates are a bit fuzzy, but it looks like Russia's well over 160,000 military dead and over 700,000 casualties as a whole, dead and wounded. So there are reasons why Putin might want a respite in some sense to try and regenerate forces and those kinds of things. But I don't think that changes the overall picture. So just to remark on one axis of attack among the many coming out of Donetsk city to the northwest. First, there was the Battle of Avdiivka, then the Battle of Pokrovsk. Just in that one axis, Russia has lost more than 100,000 troops. they've lost, which is bigger than the entire British army, right? They've lost more tanks in that battle than any other military in Europe has. So the materiel and manpower losses that Russia is taking for its very grinding style of offensives is quite high. Now, having said that, I don't see any reason to think that in the next year that Russia will run out of manpower or materiel or money. So I expect the war to continue. I don't expect there to be a ceasefire, and obviously that's the point of this conversation. But I think the war will continue. I think Russia will continue to take heavy losses. I think they will not achieve a militarily meaningful breakthrough. It will continue to be a battle of attrition, even without some U.S. support. And some U.S. support is important in areas like air defense, long-range precision fires, and those sorts of things. But given Ukrainian increasing capacity in terms of our drone production, artillery production, and other areas, I think with European support, Ukraine can stay in the fight. And as I already indicated, I think Russia also can stand the fight. So I don't expect this war to end in 2025.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Brian. Our next speaker will be Olga Onik, who is a professor, a chair in comparative and Ukrainian politics at the University of Manchester. And I will note that Onik is the first ever holder of a full professorship in Ukrainian politics in the English-speaking world, and making the University of Manchester the first English language university to host such a professorship. Olga, it's wonderful to have you back here again. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Josh. It always just actually tickles me so wonderfully that I have this honor to be this, and I hope there's many more in all your different institutions to come. So I'd like to pick up this point that the battle of attrition. So battles of attrition are all about commitment to the cause in the end, plus variables about able to continue the war, yeah? But commitment to the cause is a fundamental factor. And one of the things that I'm struck in both when it's Kremlin insiders, when it's EU and, well, UK policymakers that are currently involved in trying to push forward some kind of a ceasefire, some kind of a deal, and certainly in the United States, is the continuation of certain misconceptions and miscalculation at the Ukrainian level. So I think the central focus that I'd like to just shed some light on is not actually on the elite level, but on the ordinary citizen level. So first off, I heard a few folks connected to the negotiations within the Trump administration on television talking about still those tropes of Russophones and Ukrainophones and how this is divided, and that the Russophone population will accept this kind of cutting up of Ukraine and giving of these Russophone territories to Russia. Now, that's obviously somebody that hasn't checked the data in a very long time, but what we have seen more specifically, and this is a wake-up call for some commentators, is that we obviously have seen a massive movement of people that were formerly Russophones to Ukrainophone positions and choosing to speak Ukrainian more prominently. Now, why is this important? They are also consuming Ukrainian language-based news sources, Ukrainian language-based information, and it's a little bit more difficult to target them with strategic disinformation tactics about Russia's pending victory or the success of any kind of occupation that might, and what it might mean for them. Also, we know that this is not simply a rally effect. This is quite sticky. So we've been following this now for 3 years, and we see that the populations have fundamentally changed. So that's something that folks, okay, on the basic element seem to not get. But I think the second thing that folks don't get is that this is a civilian army. Commitment to the cause is protecting your own friends and family. If we know that about 31% of the Ukrainian population, according to our latest survey that just finished in January of this year, if we know that 31% of the population has a close friend or family member living under occupation, then this is the commitment to the cause. It is not commitment to land. It is a commitment to freeing those living under occupation and very likely living through horrific experiences and repression. Secondly, not only is the army a civilian army, and therefore there's a strong commitment to the cause, they are very much supported by the civilian population still today. And again, our ongoing survey studies show that 80% of the civilian population is actively engaged in the war effort in some way. Now, this has grown over time, not diminished. We don't only take Ukrainians' word for it, right? We don't only believe what they tell us in survey. We also follow a variety of other data points, including tracking bank donation spending and the like. And we do find that it's not only continuing, but growing in some sectors. And that's really fascinating. This means that you have a population that is highly armed, highly committed to the cause, not because of territory, but because of humans and people and family members. Now, that seems to be a major misunderstanding so far. But what is most important about driving a wartime engagement of civilian populations in Ukraine is this commitment to the cause is driven by two variables. On the one hand, it's driven by support for democracy. So the folks that are actively engaged in the war effort and supporting the army very actively are actually more likely to support democracy. They are also the ones who believe fervently at about 70-something% that any negotiated deal must result in a referendum, right? A referendum for all Ukrainian citizens. But also there's this other variable, and it's unwillingness to give up territory. So you have a highly active society that has fundamentally changed, portions of have fundamentally changed and moved to this more centered nationalist medium. And you also have folks that are committed to the cause. So we're starting to develop this kind of perfect storm, right? These are also ordinary citizens that have direct access to a variety of arms. So if you are really trying to figure out how to deal with this population, you cannot be only thinking of an elite deal. Now, this is the third strange miscalculation, misunderstanding that seems to be filtering through these ceasefire negotiations, and certainly through the rhetoric coming out of American policymakers close to the Trump administration. And this idea, and I think other politicians in Europe also, there were points in time where they debated whether this is a possibility. This idea that there could be backdoor deals with other elite actors in Ukraine that will undermine Zelensky's legitimacy and that they will be supported by key constituencies in Ukraine. Now, there is no data to suggest this is true. People completely misunderstood some of the declining in approval ratings that we saw last year towards Zelensky. And folks seem to not have been paying attention. The bump, yes, there was a bump recently since February 2025. And of course, the infamous White House, it was a debacle on all sides, I think is the only way we can describe that. But certainly, what we know is that there was an attempt to delegitimize Zelensky as the main negotiating politician, right? There was an attempt to suggest that he should step down. In fact, Russia has doubled down on this on Friday. The individuals that have been approached, whether it's Yulia Tymoshenko or Petro Poroshenko or several others and their teams, they do not stand a chance getting the mass support of this population. They are not only in single digits, their disapproval and dislike among huge constituencies of Ukrainians is just enormous. It's just, this is not the Ukraine of 2010. This is not the Ukraine of 2014. This is not the Ukraine of 2004. Elite pacts, elite coordination in Ukraine will not work if it is not something supported by the Ukrainian population. And finally, this perfect storm of not understanding this context is also not understanding that Zelensky does have red lines, and he repeatedly mentions them, whether it was in 2021, whether it was on the eve of February 24th, 2022, whether it was in September 2022 when he came up with the 10 points that he is negotiating on, whether it's the adjusted version of that we saw in January. There are red lines, and those red lines he is constitutionally unable to commit any territorial concessions. This is something he would be tried for. And this is a country that gets rid of and tries its politicians if necessary. Secondly, red line was any kind of aid cannot be now flipped as debt. That's a red line. He has stuck to that red line throughout the last 3 years. I don't see him moving on that. And the final red line is, of course, this mineral deal as part of developing negotiations going forward to a ceasefire. It was actually Zelensky's administration's idea. This is a conversation. There's very good reasons for it. It would allow for Americans to be involved in the demining of very key territories, but also this clause that would go against basic rules within the EU that would not allow Ukraine then to be a full member of the EU when it comes to market elements. So these are sticky points that are not going to change on the Ukrainian side. There are things that can be negotiated. There are elements that are possible in the ceasefire. But it seems this trying to play this old school game of flipping the legitimacy of a president only works in the inverse. So we've seen in the last week, I've worked with colleagues in The Economist, we've seen approval ratings for Zelensky, specifically in his international actions, soaring, whereas we saw approval ratings for these other politicians decline, especially when it came out that they are potentially engaged in back channels. Now, I say all these things, folks don't seem to care sometimes because it's big actor politics, elite actor politics. But deep down inside, a country that is engaged, that is committed to the cause, that has access to vast weapons, this is the potential tinderbox. Now, yes, this is this is the worst case scenario for European security. Maybe the American colleagues don't care so much about European security anymore, but also this is not what Putin wants. He does not want a highly militarized civilian partisan Ukraine. And that's where he is going right now if he keeps pushing the sort of things he's pushing. He can't win what he sought out to win, this initial victory. That is impossible, but it is possible to have some kind of middle ground victory. Now, we'll see if Putin says that's enough for now. But it seems like he's going for the full 100%, and then it will be a loss.
Thank you so much, Olga. Our next speaker is Emma Ashford, who is a senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center. Emma?
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me and to the colleagues for these interesting points already. So I guess let me try and perhaps talk a little less about, the war itself and a little more about the view from DC right now, what it is the administration is trying to do, how it differs from the last administration, which I think might be helpful here. So, I mean, in all of this, ever since February 2022, the biggest question has been how this war will end. Now, that sounds really facile and oversimplified, but it's also tied up, I think, with this notion of, how far is the West willing to go in backing Ukraine? Those two are intrinsically linked. And this question that's been debated, not just in Washington, not just in Kyiv, but on all these different European capitals, of whether the goal of backing Ukraine is negotiated settlement, to get to a good enough peace, or whether it is victory, right, to win back everything that has been lost. That debate has been ongoing through this entire time. The European Council on Foreign Relations did a wonderful poll about a year ago, I think it was, where they framed this as the Justice Party and the Peace Party, right? They did polling across Europe where they found that, Eastern Europeans were much more inclined towards the justice approach, right? That Russia needs to be made to pay for everything that it's done. And Western Europeans tended more to the peace approach. That is to say, it's better to get a settlement and end the killing, right? So I think, there's also debate on the Russian side about what they're trying to achieve in this, but at least on the Ukrainian Western side, this is the fundamental dilemma when we think about ending the war. The Biden team fell somewhere between these two options, right? They said explicitly, openly, and repeatedly that their goal was to help Ukraine win battlefield victories that would put it in a better negotiating position at the negotiating table that was inevitable, right? So they were not backing this idea of absolute victory, but they basically wanted to help Ukraine achieve as much as it could on the battlefield in order to enter those negotiations from a strong position. And they also took this line of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, which basically meant, that they were sort of putting Kyiv in the driver's seat of when that process of negotiation might open. This obviously became problematic over the 3 years of the war, because this doesn't answer the fundamental question of when is good enough good enough, right? This is not a problem that's unique to Ukraine. This is basically the classic problem of war termination, right? How does either side in a war determine that they've achieved as much as they can, and not get overconfident when they're winning, and not, sue for peace when they're losing. So this is the same problem. And we can see sort of two distinct periods, two distinct windows in this war where this has already played out, right? We see the initial peace negotiations in May of 2022, only about 3 months into the war in Istanbul, where, the Ukrainians and the Russians, it is definitely an exaggeration to say they were close to a deal, but they were talking for real about the specific issues that would be needed to move towards a settlement. And that didn't pan out for a couple of reasons. One being the revelation of some of the atrocities that had happened in Bucha as the Russians withdrew. But then the second one was, encouragement from various Western partners to the Ukrainians to say, we're pretty sure that with our assistance, you can win territory back, you can do better, and then you can enter negotiations from a stronger position. And to some extent, that was actually correct, right? The Ukrainians then went on to recapture significant territory that year. You can see a similar debate in spring of 2023 before Ukraine's big counteroffensive that then failed. And again, the debate is, do you use this future counteroffensive as leverage, saying, well, look how well we did last time, maybe we'll take more back, Russia, you should really negotiate now? Or do you say, well, let's pursue the counteroffensive and see how well it goes, and then hopefully we'll be in a stronger position? And at that time around, it didn't work out, right? Ukraine did not make any significant gains. And so, as the Biden administration starts to wind down, I think what officials within the administration basically found was that they were trapped. They were admitting that Ukraine's negotiating position was not strong enough to actually enter into negotiations, but the steps that would be required to actually put Ukraine in a very strong negotiating position would require escalation of a kind the administration had already sworn off. And so, trapped between sort of this justice and peace, they couldn't really figure out a way out of it. That brings us to the Trump administration, right? This is not how they see this problem at all. They view Ukrainian and US interests as distinct, right? So the first thing that we can kind of throw out with this administration is nothing about Kyiv without Kyiv, right? That is just not something that this administration really cares about. They also draw a distinction between European interests and US interests writ broader. So for many of the principals in this administration, their viewpoint, I think this was exemplified most effectively in that leaked signal chat of about a week ago. They think that, Ukraine is Europe's problem. It is closer to Europe. Europeans should handle it. They can handle it. And so again, they're drawing these distinctions between interests in a way that the Biden administration never did. The administration also thinks that the war is unlikely to improve, right? So the Biden administration, I think, was willing to not enter negotiations. Maybe if we just keep going like we have been, things will improve over a 2 to 3 year period. The Trump administration does not believe that. They believe that, this war is, Ukraine is leeching manpower, that they're mostly spent, that this retreat will continue. And perhaps, again, more importantly, for an administration that sees itself entirely through the prism of US interests, they believe the war continuing is a drain on American resources. It drains cash, it drains attention of policymakers, and most importantly, for many, drains weapons they want to use in the Indo-Pacific instead. And they see Ukraine's position as getting weaker over time, therefore, this is the time to enter into these negotiations. And I'll throw in a final point here, which I think, it gets portrayed in the media, I think, a little simplistically as the administration wants to do a reverse Kissinger. They want to flip Russia away from China, and then suddenly we're allies with the Russians and we're all focused on the Chinese. I think that's very oversimplified. What I would say instead is I think folks in this administration have not embraced the Biden administration's axis of authoritarians framing, right? They don't necessarily see China and Russia as the same problem, and they want to be able to talk to Russia and not to necessarily center US-Russian relations on Ukraine. So under Biden, US-Russian relations basically became Ukraine and nothing else. The Trump administration, I think, wants scope to talk about other interests and other issues, and sidelining the conflict in Ukraine is one of the ways that you can do that. So I think that is the worldview, and that is where they're coming from. The process thus far, as we saw first time around in the Trump administration and seeing again, everything's a little, catch as catch can, right? They tend to just do things and sort of see if it works out. But where we seem to have landed is direct US-Russian talks folding in Ukraine. So there's no direct Ukraine to Russia talks, but the idea being that the US is going to talk to both sides. And as folks have alluded to already, they're trying to start small, build confidence with things like restarting the Black Sea grain deal, this infrastructure and or energy ceasefire, if we ever figure out which it is. And at least in theory, the idea is the US is pressuring both sides, right? We saw a lot of pressure placed on the Ukrainians, particularly after that Oval Office meeting, on the minerals deal, but also shutting off aid to try and push the Ukrainians to agree to actually talk. And less so, but I think a little more in the last few days, we've seen sanctions threats on Russia. So the plan is to pressure both sides to try and get to a deal. Thus far, and I'll wrap up pretty soon, I think we've had minimal success, right? Because the Ukrainians are very resistant for many of the reasons Olga outlined, right? Zelensky himself is caught between his population and the demands of the US in this context, and that's a difficult position to be in. The Russians are overconfident. What a surprise for anyone that watches Russia. They think that they can do better even than the things that Trump is offering them, and so they're being resistant to negotiating. And I think on the domestic politics side in the US, there's also some internal administration opposition to pursuing this approach. We see this in Middle Eastern issues on Iran, and we're seeing it again on Ukraine, that there's internal dissatisfaction with where this is going within the administration. So, just where does this leave us, right? There is, I think, a very real prospect that negotiations collapse, Trump sours on Russia. I doubt, however, in that scenario that he dials up Ukraine aid significantly, right? I think it would be more likely that something kind of akin to what I think Brian was talking about a little, right, where Ukraine is more self-sufficient and relies more on European states. I don't see this administration flipping 180 and going back to Biden's policy. But I do think it's also very possible that we get some set of smaller deals. Ideally, they lead to something bigger. More likely, we just get a series of small deals on bits of a ceasefire that result in some sort of continued low-level hostilities. The Trump administration declares victory and goes home. So, I think that's sort of the spectrum of likely options right now. And with that, I'll stop there and turn it over to Catherine.
Thank you so much. Emma. Our final speaker is Catherine Stoner, who is the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and a senior fellow at CDRL and the Center on International Security and Cooperation at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford University. Welcome, Catherine.
Great, thank you very much. So the danger, of course, in going last is that everybody has said everything that needed to be said. But actually, I will try and link up a little bit to, as soon as Brian started talking, I thought, well, I agree with that. Yep, okay. And gradually, I think my thoughts have evolved since, 36 minutes ago. I would agree with Emma that we are seeing a shift, obviously, in U.S. policy from what it was under the Biden administration with respect to the war in Ukraine, from as long as it takes in terms of supporting Ukraine, but slowly supplying arms to Ukraine but providing intelligence, which was important. And I think we've seen on the Ukrainian side a lot of frustration with the United States. On the one hand, as long as it takes and we'll help you. On the other hand, it's so slow getting things over. I know that the past administration, their explanation would be, well, you can't just hand someone the keys to an F-16 and say, hey, good luck. It takes some training, and so all of this has taken time. I'm not exactly sure where reality is. But I think the unfortunate thing with the past administration is that we gave them just enough to survive, the Ukrainians, but not enough to win. And there was once the attempted big surge a year and a half ago failed, we really didn't have a lot more to supply the Ukrainians other than intelligence. But in the meantime, Ukrainians have become really good at defending themselves, and in particular by developing things like drones, right? So it's much less important now that we provide tanks as much as it is that they use drones. But that said, there are certain things that obviously Ukraine needs primarily from the United States, and there's a big question if we stop supplying those things, like in particular anti-missile technology to create a dome around big cities like Kyiv, will we still allow Ukraine to use European money to purchase those things? Okay, so big change in policy. There was also, though, I think, a growing question in Congress. We saw this sort of foreshadowed, and it could be partly why Biden was a little bit tentative, which was a growing question about the value of this to the United States among Republicans in Congress, slowing aid, of course, rather infamously. So here we are back with Trump and Putin. And so what I wanted to do was actually kind of compare the two of them in their worldviews and see where this leaves us in the end. And I'm going to end up with a slightly different conclusion than Emma, although make some similar points, I think. So these two guys are very, very different, obviously, in terms of background. And the reason I'm going to focus on them as opposed to Russia and the United States, as though there's a Mr. Russia and a Mr. United States, is because they both, Trump in particular, thinks of politics in very personal terms. We can think back to the relationship with North Korea, right? I looked into those eyes and the beautiful letters. And I'll just read you a quick quote from February 23rd, 2022, where Trump thought that Putin's decision to go into Ukraine is genius, right? Remember, he described it that way. He says, "I knew Putin very well. I got along with him great. He liked me. I liked him." I'll do some of the hand gestures. I mean, he's a tough cookie. He's got a lot of the great charm and a lot of pride, but the way he loves his country, he loves his country. So he thinks of it in very personal terms. He's a nice guy, loves his country. Remember, he rejects US intelligence about Russian interference in the 2016 elections and accepts instead Russian intelligence. He thinks of Putin as his friend. And Putin, of course, is able to take advantage of this fully, because one thing he is not is stupid. So different backgrounds. New York, billionaire, maybe, accustomed to making real estate deals. Everything is transactional. Everyone has a price. Values don't really matter. Never admit a mistake. On the other hand, with Putin, we have a former KGB agent, and there are some people who say you're never former, you're always KGB, who grew up on the tough streets of St. Petersburg, describes himself as a bit of a thug. But Trump is obviously older than Putin, not many years though, 6 or so. And they have a similar worldview nonetheless, despite these different backgrounds. They're both hyper realists. This idea that might makes right in the international system is anarchical, and power is the main goal of every country, and you can array countries on a spectrum from weak to strong by simply looking at the size of their populations, how much money they have, that is their economy, and how big and capable their military is. And thus we get Trump referring to some countries that require aid in sub-Saharan Africa, using an expletive, whole countries, and kind of shrugging off the value of alliances, right? We have great powers in the world, according to both of them. Great powers have privileges. The international rules are not for me, but for thee. And because we're so strong, we can decide whether we will adhere to international rules or not. Values, domestic politics, those aren't important. So it matters not a whit that Ukraine is more liberal democratic, and the Biden line and European that Ukraine is really defending democracy for Europe. And defending Europe from further autocratization by Russia. That this just doesn't matter for Trump at all. Only power matters in the pursuit of power, and in particular American power. They're both nationalists. So when Trump said in the quote I read you, he loves his country, he loves his country. Trump thinks he loves his country too. He may think he loves the United States more than he loves himself. But I think both of them fuse their countries with themselves, right? There is no Russia without Putin, and there is no Putin without Russia. Well, I think Trump thinks much the same way about the United States and his role. They both see their countries, Russia and America, as exceptional nations, that they get special privileges in the world. Alliances are temporary and they weaken great powers. And so relations are transactional, even with China, right? Russia is getting along with China now. And I think it's sort of interesting that Putin always and Xi always go through how much they love each other in every meeting, and that they're one another's very, very best friends in the world, and give each other little awards. It's almost like, somebody who's, cheating in a marriage professes how much they love their wife or husband a little too much. So again, alliances are temporary. They are relationships are transactional, and ultimately alliances weaken great powers. They drag us down. We don't need NATO. Those people, need to pay up, as though NATO allies in Europe are paying into a country club of Trump's, and they must pay at least 2% tithe. Now maybe it's higher, 3%. He's not wrong to point out, by the way, that there are some European countries that could have done much better and have made mistakes, but other presidents have pointed this out. It's just he has done it in such a vociferous way. And then finally, so they're realists, they're nationalists, and they are illiberal. Trump refers to lunatic left-wing liberals here in the United States. Sometimes they're judges, sometimes they're Democratic members of Congress, sometimes they're leaders of Europe. And Putin infamously has declared liberalism dead. They don't like wokeism. And so, they are united in terms of their worldview in that respect. Okay. So does this mean this new reset in relations? And I'll just quickly point out that pretty much every American president who comes into office attempts a reset in relations with Russia. Will this succeed? And will this lead to, an end, peace in our time with Russia and Ukraine, with the US's new administration mediating between them, or will it lead eventually to conflict? Emma mentioned small victories. I think the victories will be very small, if at all. Russia is clearly not serious about negotiating, and that was very obvious when you just looked at who was sent to Saudi Arabia to start these negotiations. As soon as I saw the name Sergei Beseda, I thought, okay, this is not going to happen. This is not somebody who wants to end this war. This is somebody who was intimately involved in starting the war to begin with, and so they are just going to come through with the same messages that they started the war with, and sure enough, here's where we are. Realism and a realist view of the world as being divided up between great powers Well, historically, this has led to conflict, right? And especially conflict in Europe in the 20th century, two big wars. It has not led to cooperation. Um, Putin has a very clear sense of Russia's interests, and he has articulated them consistently again and again and again, and continues to do so. He takes advantage of the relative ignorance and inexperience of Trump's team. Steve Witkoff has no business at all doing this negotiation, and this just simply strengthens the Russian hand. But somebody seems to be hinting to Trump that maybe he's got it wrong, and so now we're getting just slight criticisms of Russia and this threat of more sanctions being put on Russia, possibly if we don't move forward on a deal. Trump thinks relationships between leaders matters as a realist, and this is all about power, and Putin's a guy who's all about power, and so we get each other. I'm going to say they don't get each other, except that they're both all about power. But Putin doesn't really think personal relationships with leaders matter. Trump may go on and think Putin's his best friend, and Putin encourages this, and I'll finish in just about 1 minute, encourages this with, sending a portrait of himself from, quote, Russia's best artist, whatever, a portrait of Trump, and then telling Witkoff to tell Trump he prayed for him when Trump was shot this summer. Just ridiculous things that he knew would appeal to Trump's ego. They did short term, evidently. But the other thing is that Trump and Putin both don't see a problem with countries taking land, right? Especially great powers. Witness J.D. Vance's recent trip to Greenland, and we must have it. And hopefully it won't come to the use of force, but he doesn't really recognize the sovereignty of other countries, just like Putin. So the U.S. is abandoning alliances, and this has provided opportunities for Russia. And there already were plenty of opportunities that we began ceding to Russia, even under the Obama administration when we were leading from behind. America first is America alone. And this, I would say, will weaken the United States. The only time Article 5 of the NATO treaty has been invoked was in Afghanistan, when our NATO allies came to help us after we had been attacked in the homeland. So I suspect that Putin is going to go on and drag out attempted negotiations, and we're starting to see little hints that Trump is getting a little frustrated with that. There may even be a summit, but I think nothing at all will come of this. Even a bad peace from Ukraine for Ukraine won't end the conflict. They'll just simply begin terrorizing Russia domestically using drones and whatnot. Emma mentioned quite rightly that Trump perceives himself as now trying to pressure both sides, and of course just pressuring Zelensky and the Ukrainians, initially really terrorizing them in a way by cutting off intelligence and arms briefly. But we've lost a lot of leverage on Russia. The Russian economy, I'll just point out, for all of the problems that Brian mentioned quite rightly about continuing to pursue this war, it grew 4.1% last year. Now, yes, that a lot of that is coming from government spending on the war, and they have a labor shortage and all of that. And long term, this is a disaster. But how long is long term? And I would also say that Putin is an autocrat who doesn't think long term. This is not going according to necessarily some strategic plan. It's going according to his gut. So in the long term, countries that believed in great power rivalries and that might makes right, we've seen this show before. It led to war and conflict. And I think that's probably where we're going longer term. Whether or not it's in the next 3 or 4 years is a question. But until Putin leaves office, I think this is what we have.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine. So I'm going to pose the first question, and I'd like each of you to think about a brief response to this and take just one piece of it that's relevant or that speaks to you. And that's a question about how Our topic today relates to or is embedded in changing relations in the transatlantic relationship, especially between the US and the European Union. And how might this affect either the landscape and architecture or durability of a peace agreement? How might it affect sanctions, Ukrainian attitudes, um, questions about geopolitical shifts and alignments? It strikes me that if Europe was all, in addition to Ukraine, Europe was also excluded from this high-level summit in Riyadh, which also marks a stark departure from previous sort of practice. So maybe let's start with Emma on this as an astute geopolitical observer. Then I'll go to Olga, then Brian, then Catherine. So Emma, how does the transatlantic dimension figure or doesn't figure into all this?
Well, thank you for implying I know what I'm talking about. I think it's very clear at the moment that none of us has any idea what's actually happening. Look, I think one of the big ways in which the Biden administration over the last 4 years sort of proved itself to be a little hollow in policy is basically perpetuating the idea that there is no divergence and will be no divergence in interests between the US and Europe and Ukraine. And you can point to loads of examples, right? You can point to Poland and Ukraine. You can point to, Ukraine and Germany on Nord Stream, even before you get to the transatlantic bit of it. So I think, to some extent, we're coming back to reality in terms of understanding that there might be differences between Europe and the US. Then, of course, the Trump administration takes it a lot further because they really do want to dial down US presence in Europe. They want to burden shift to the Europeans. And to some extent think the Europeans don't matter, right? They are very dismissive of them. And so, for me, I think one of the big concerns here is that I think these things are currently on separate tracks, but they could quite easily feed each other. So if we see the European Union, as von der Leyen suggested the other day, resisting sanctions relief in the context of some US deal in Ukraine, I strongly suspect that's going to push the Trump administration to take a harder line on the burden-shifting transatlantic relations part of it. So I think even though these are sort of somewhat separate issues, there's a very real possibility the Europeans end up caught in this net as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, those are exactly the kind of issue linkages I think our audience needs to consider and be aware of. Olga, what about you? What about the EU dimension in all this? Oh, you're on mute.
That never happens to me. I'm actually going to be in Brussels next week, and I've been there now 3 times and in DC earlier in the year. So it's really interesting to actually speak to various intelligence and policy communities in these 2 spaces, and of course here in the United Kingdom. And there was this shock and awe moment of not understanding what's happening, both in the US, to be perfectly clear. For the first time ever, I saw colleagues in DC clearly visibly shaken and not knowing what's happening next. Here in the United Kingdom, we've had a little bit of the same, but a realization that the United Kingdom is going to play a very particular role in at least some of the background, bringing folks together and whatever carrots or sticks that the UK might have. And this has been a wake-up call, certainly for European colleagues out of Brussels, but also across several different capitals in continental Europe. It is, of course, a diverse set of actors with some disagreements, very loud ones. We had a Slovak politician saying how much someone recently has called him some names, that being Ursula von der Leyen. But aside from those individual disagreements, there's actually more unity than we have seen in perhaps decades, and a more recognition that there has to be investment in European security, that it has to be European-led, that it has to be European coordinated, and that this is the direction in which it's going. So whilst the conversation is still Americans are our allies, of course, the Anglo-Saxons, as Putin likes to call them, are also Europe's allies, but there's a very strong recognition, including the capacity to use nuclear weapons in the United Kingdom, the particular arrangement that is here. The population's only now starting to realize that there's been a lease on the capacity to use nuclear weapons with the United States. Now, what I find very interesting is that people seem to miss in the negotiations that we have seen, Europe has not been formally at the table with its own representatives. Yes, that is true. But something that is, I think, very interesting is that European powers were represented via the Ukrainian representatives. So they first in tandem met here in London, then moved to Brussels, and I moved with them for all those conversations. And then the Ukrainian team was actually representing something that had the unity of the United Kingdom plus the EU at the table. And the Ukrainians knew that this is what they had when they were going for that particular air and sea proposal of ceasefires. So the irony here is that I think Starmer did an excellent job in coordinating Europeans. And of course, the Europeans have done this with their own meetings. And there it is. Ukraine is now representing the united European view in the negotiations. And that's not something anyone had, I think, on their bingo card just a few years ago. I just want to note one thing that Catherine said. This thing about strong powers. I mean, I'm more with I think Tim Fry and others, this weak strong men idea. I don't think that Russia is that strong, and its inability, as Brian said, to edge out any real wins territorially, and how long and how painful that is, in fact, to do, and how it would take a century to take all of Ukraine. This is not the kind of strong power that the US could do that, quite frankly. And so I think something that Trump is starting perhaps to notice, that there is a great deal of strength. Maybe it's not geopolitical, it's not weapons bound, it's not military bound in Ukraine. Ukraine is not a nuclear power, but there is a strength in the type of leadership that Zelensky has, and there's a strength in your citizens backing you. Now, I'm very certain President Trump would like his worst opponents to defend him if he made a mistake geopolitically internationally. And that's what happened in Ukraine. You had some of the staunchest opponents, including ordinary citizens that, quite frankly, want to see Zelensky gone 3 years ago, outwardly defend him. And there is a certain strength in that and a capacity to keep going in difficult negotiations. And so the psychological profile of Zelensky's needs to be, I think, more examined. This is a person that is a formidable manager, a formidable character that has been undermined as a comedian, and quite frankly, very good at his job and very good at having people feel for him and then unite around him in a way that we haven't seen Europe do in ages.
No, great. Thanks for that. Brian, same to you on the EU.
Yeah, I'm going to take the transatlantic piece and look at it from the Putin lens. So Vladimir Putin, has pretty consistently talked about the U.S. European allies as vassals and as subordinate to U.S. interests. And I think he is first of all focused on Ukraine, right? That this is the reason for the war. But we should bear in mind that Putin also put on the table a bunch of conditions about European security in the months prior to the invasion, wanting to roll back NATO deployments into the new member states and a freeze on further NATO enlargement. And I think Putin would see it as a very big win if this dissension between the U.S., I should say, not North America, because Canada is still all in with the Europeans in Ukraine, but between the U.S. and its European allies, as a very big side benefit of Trump's return to the Oval Office. And I think part of the Russian strategy in the current negotiations is to do a deal with the U.S., not just about Ukraine, but about broader issues, appealing to Trump's notion that there's much that can be gained economically from restarting relations with Russia. Economically, that's actually not true. Russia is not that important to the United States, but Trump seems to think it is. And anything that Putin can do to bring the U.S.-Russia relationship to the fore, and therefore, in some sense, try to peel off the United States from its European allies is a big win for him, and he would think that would make it much easier for him to achieve his objectives in Ukraine. It's debatable whether that is in fact the case, but for now I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And Catherine.
Sure. So just a quick response to Olga. I think you maybe misunderstood what I was saying. I was not saying that Russia is particularly strong per se. I was saying that they see the world the same way, as in being broken up into great powers. And his perception, Putin's perception, is that Russia is a great power. And to be frank, if you look at to the extent that they're worth anything right now, public opinion polls on whether Russians think Russia is a great power, they do. So whether we think it is, or I was merely talking about the perceptions. I think Tim was, and I've talked to Tim Fry about this, and I've written reviews of his book. I think he's a little bit wrong about the weak strongman thing, because where are the constraints that he's talked about on Putin domestically? And I'm as guilty. Honestly, I wrote a book called Russia Resurrected: Its Power and Purpose in a New Global Order. And I anticipated there would be more constraints on Putin because I thought he would be unwilling to use domestic repression so effectively. And he was, he was willing to do it. I would also say he's no longer a spin dictator, he's just a dictator. Straight up, he uses force and spin. And I think we all thought that he was, kind of Dan Treason and Sergei Guriev, more of a modern autocrat in the sense that he wasn't going to use just plain blunt force against his own people, but he's willing to do that. So I completely agree with you. I'm just talking about what their perceptions of the world are, and that they are both realists, and they now, whether Putin overestimates Russia's capabilities, well, he'd be guilty of this just as almost every single ruler of Russia, the Soviet Union, in the past. But I do think in one very important respect, and this may ultimately lead to his demise and that of his regime, is that there are no constraints on him. So I don't think he's a weak, strong man in his own milieu. He's a strong man. He doesn't have any challengers, and instead, what we have are oligarchs who are calling people in the United States and Europe, saying, "How can I get off the sanctions list?" Friedman, Oven, these folks really desperately want to get off, but they feel trapped now. So those are exactly the people that many of us anticipated would be some sort of constraint on Putin in projecting Russian power. So in absolute terms, obviously, Russia is in no sense as powerful from a realist perspective as the United States, right? We have the most of everything. China has a lot of many things, and Russia would be like number 6. I have a friend who worked in the Department of Defense under Biden, and he would say that, the Russian military was the second most powerful in Ukraine at any one time. Not that powerful, right? So I think you misunderstood what I was saying. I actually agree with you. I was talking about his view of the world more than anything. In terms of sanctions, yes, it's fascinating. This is, again, I think Trump's realist view of the world. Alliance is not important, right? Those Europeans, and we heard J.D. Vance say it, and Pete Hegseth luckily on Signal, saying, yeah, it's pathetic, right? In all caps, how the Europeans take advantage of us, and we should really find a way to charge them, Stephen Miller said, for how much this is going to cost us to hit the Houthis. Okay, so this is extraordinarily naive, right? Again, they don't understand that we don't live in the 19th and early 20th centuries any longer, and we don't actually control the SWIFT system alone. So, and the Russians well know this, right? So, in terms of asking for SWIFT sanctions to be removed, even from Russell Bank, they obviously know we have to get the Europeans to do that because SWIFT works out of Belgium, and it is controlled by about 12 central banks, including the European Union Central Bank. So this is something that even if Trump wanted to do it, he can't do it. And he's already threatened, that the US may well pull out of NATO. Well, he doesn't control the European Union, and that this also is important. And now there is talk of possibly creating a European Union military. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, the Europeans, to some degree, have been quite foolish about ceding their security to the United States and assuming that we will always have a president who shares liberal values and wants a Europe whole and free, and sees the value in that and the peace dividend since the Second World War. Well, now we have someone who doesn't seem to understand it or know it. He may learn it. But his power ultimately is not absolute. There are certain limits. I think again, this is why I'm not very optimistic. I'm worried that we'll see conflict in Europe that spreads in the next, maybe 5 to 10 years if this is not turned around rather quickly with a future administration in the United States.
Maybe following up a little bit on that point, Catherine, but also Emma, you made this point at the end of your talk about, the U.S. deciding to say they had victory and then go home at that point, and the U.S. goes home. I think this all leads nicely into a question by Matthew Murray, who's an adjunct at CEPA and Harriman, who writes in the Q&A, could the speakers address a possible scenario in which the Trump administration, facing the obstacles to a quick peace deal that the speakers have identified, decides to blame Russia and Ukraine and move forward with its agenda, dropping peace in Ukraine as a priority? What would this scenario portend for Ukraine? So I think this is I'd like to hear a little bit more about this. If one of the things with the administration that I think a lot of people who are watching everything they're doing is how long they keep focus and attention on particular issues. Ukraine was supposed to be solved on day one. I think it was supposed to be solved on the day he was elected. Then it was supposed to be solved on day one. What if the U.S. sort of loses interest in the conflict? What happens at that point? And so, Emma, since you ended with that, maybe I'll go to you first on that point, but I would love to hear from all the panelists on this one.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think does link to the last set of questions. I mean, if I could just, I guess, push back a little on what Catherine was saying about sanctions. I mean, I think the US does have significant amount of pressure to push Europeans to lift SWIFT-based sanctions. I mean, it's not nice, the pressure that we can put, but we have examples from past administrations. I think it was the George W. Bush administration put pressure on the Europeans to sanction, was it the Iranians? I'm forgetting the details, but we have in the past used this kind of pressure, and Trump has shown very willing to use the kind of pressure points that we have with European states, right? Whether that is military deployments, whether that's NATO, whether that's economic tariffs. So, I mean, again, I would be very wary of saying that, the US cannot push or force these concessions if they want from the Europeans. I mean, I do kind of agree with you that I think the Russians knew what they were asking for. And in some ways, this is a test, right? Is the US going to be willing to push the Europeans this way? My general inclination, my assessment is that the administration probably will not burn that many bridges for a short ceasefire deal. They might for something more major. And so to this question that Josh asked that was in the Q&A, will the administration at a certain point just blame Russia, blame Ukraine, and go away? I do think that's entirely possible, but I think it would also be blaming Europe if that were the case. I think it would be particular focus on Ukraine and on European states. They would be framed as wanting to continue to fight, that it's a lost cause, that they're bellicose, that they oppose peace. I would not necessarily say it's out of the realm of possibility that Russia does not get the blame in this scenario, and that the administration simply moves ahead without the Europeans. But again, back to the previous question about transatlantic relations and how this feeds into this, one could even see some folks inside the administration being okay with this because this feeds their European agenda as much as it feeds, trying to find a peace in Ukraine. And I'll leave it to others to talk a little bit about how, Ukraine might cope in that case. But I don't necessarily think that, a Ukraine that's continuing to fight on its own, supported to some extent by Europeans, where the US has pulled back, that's not necessarily a loss as far as the Trump administration views these things, I don't think.
Ola, do you want to take it from there?
Sure. Catherine, I didn't misunderstand you. I thought it was just important to stress that point, that perceptions are important, but rather I do think there are My understanding is that there are people within the Kremlin that are ready to jump at the chance, and I'm not going to talk about how I know that, but I'm pretty confident that that's the case. But let's go to this question. Josh, you and Alex invited myself and several other colleagues in, was it February or January 2022? And we had this conversation, and I said, Ukrainians will hold, Ukrainians will not go, I was one of the few people saying, it's not going to be 3 days, it's not going to be several weeks, Ukrainians will hold, you will see all of eastern, southern Ukraine rise, all these things that so many people, it's hard to remember 3 years ago, but so many people were surprised by. And I think it's very possible that the Trump administration goes with this option. I probably agree with Emma, blaming more Ukraine and maybe the Europeans than Russia, but the way it's looking out right now, it could be blaming everyone, that none of these folks want peace, and that's their problem. But it will be a torturous war. It will be worse and bloodier and more horrific. And I certainly do not wish that for Ukraine, considering I am Ukrainian and have friends and family living there. But Ukrainians do not stop fighting. This is the one thing, of course, they will have support of their allies. The United Kingdom is a formidable supporter. Of course, not certain things, not certain types of weapons, right? But with just javelins, and yes, those javelins came to Ukraine before 2022. But with just javelins, Ukraine was able to do quite a bit more, and it's a much more capable army than it was in 2022. In fact, both American Army and British Army are studying certain elements in certain battlefields, just trying to figure out how Ukrainians managed to do certain things or hold off for so long. Now, it is a horrific, treacherous war that continues, even with the support of European allies, and to be fair, global allies as well. But it can very easily destabilize. And there are these tensions internally. They are being manipulated specifically by disinformation campaigns on the civilian population. There are specific disinformation campaigns that are targeting the military population as well. And it is in this potential, if America does in fact just leave this war entirely, it will be not only a difficult, treacherous war, but there is a potential for there to be a rupture within Ukraine at the political elite level, maybe at the citizen level. And then we do have a destabilized European continent more broadly, and spillover, I think, is very, very possible. And here I agree with, in that case, if that's the scenario, I agree with Catherine that the spillover does take place. You do have a regional and then a potentially continental and then potentially intercontinental war in the aftermath.
Brian, maybe you could take this from the position of, you could take this from the Russian position. If the US kind of goes home, from Russia's perspective, is it just like back to business as usual as it was during the Biden administration? Or is there some sort of sense that this is a particular moment that Russia has to grasp onto, that there are opportunities here that will be less positive in the future if they don't take advantage of this kind of particular moment? And maybe even just sort of like even more insight into, like, given the Trump administration's interest right now in resolving this conflict, like, what do you think Russia's goal is at this particular moment in time? Is it just to like stall out and get to this point where the US kind of gets bored and goes home? Is it to cut this much larger deal with the US? Like, where do you see Putin's thoughts at this particular moment?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I guess I would say that I think the Matthew Murray scenario is actually the most likely one, that the United States will eventually decide, and when I say the United States, I mean more specifically Donald Trump will decide that this is much harder than he thought it was going to be. He's not going to get a Nobel Prize for solving the Russia-Ukraine war, and he's going to move on to something else. And that, I think, will imply that U.S. Assistance to Ukraine will be largely eliminated. No future large-scale military packages. It'll be interesting to see what happens with things like intelligence assistance in that scenario. And it depends a bit on who takes the blame. And if I had to guess, I think he meaning Trump would be much more likely to blame the Europeans and Zelensky than he would be to blame Putin for any breakdown in the negotiations, even though I actually think Putin will be most responsible for the breakdown in negotiations. So in response to your specific question, Josh, like what does Putin want out of this? I mean, there was a report earlier in the week, or I guess it was last week, Varda Rustamova was talking to people in, Kremlin orbits, and the reporting that she was picking up was Putin thinks he can charm, Trump into getting a deal that's beneficial to Russia, but he's quite willing to keep fighting for another century if he has to, right? And I think that's basically right, that he will try and play this to get important concessions for Russia, especially probably from the US side on the sanctions front, and shift the blame to Zelensky, but he's ready to continue fighting. So then the question becomes, what happens if the US sort of steps away from this conflict? I think Ukraine will continue to fight. I think Europe will do what it can, but there's a big collective action problem there. And the US provides certain things that Europe can't provide at the moment, and in terms of certain types of, they call them enablers, right? So some of the intel that the US provides, air transportation, air defense systems, certain types of, strike systems that Europe doesn't have in sufficient quantities at the moment. So it will get harder for Ukraine, but it wouldn't end the war, I don't think.
Great. And Catherine, same to you, but also like to have you address Renata Mustafina's question. She is a postdoc here at Harriman. That speakers today on the panel are primarily focused on political leaders and their roles in this conflict about Zelensky, Putin, Trump. However, it is reasonable to consider that the agency of other actors is also at play, and she refers to the military, intelligence services, various ministries, economic elites, local civil societies, diasporas. And is there a way to incorporate these other actors and the tensions their interventions might generate into this particular discussion? So I'm going to throw that one at you as well. My apologies for that.
Oh, not at all. I know Renata. So great question. So, okay, I'll hit that one in just a minute. So just going back a little bit in the conversation, when I was talking about SWIFT, I said the US can't do that alone. They have to negotiate with Europeans. And actually you made my point for me, right? Which, Emma, which is that they'd have to push the Europeans to do this. That's exactly what Putin wants. He's been trying to break up a Euro-Atlantic alliance and that strong relationship for at least 15 years. And he's been also trying to break up the European Union. It's much easier for Russia to deal bilaterally with countries than it is to have to adhere to European Union rules. And so, they've spent quite a lot of money in different countries trying to sort of cede Russian influence, and it's had modest success. I think this is kind of what Russia does, right? They're exacerbating cleavages that already exist at least in embryonic form. So, Trump is releasing 25% sanctions on automobiles that are not made in the United States. Well, who's that aimed at? It's aimed in large part at the European auto market. And asking French companies and soon other companies to get rid of DEI if they want to supply anything to the United States. So I think Putin again is using a weakness that's maybe already there to exacerbate problems in the Euro-American partnership, and this makes Russia stronger. And creates more opportunity for Russia. So that's really the point I was trying to make. Of course, we can push them to remove SWIFT, but they'll be rather resentful of that as they are in the sort of broader context of all the other things that are happening. How long can this administration that has a rather short attention span keep the focus on Ukraine? I think we're already seeing it wane a little bit. Although I think Emma's quite right to say, frankly, we don't know exactly what's going on behind the scenes, but some folks like Steve Witkoff and others talk quite freely. So, tell us about the painting and whatnot. But when you think about what there is on their policy agenda right now, right? It's the Middle East, which is again sort of really breaking out. It's the trade war, and this is something Trump, pardon me, really seems to care about. It's Greenland. So right, I mean, this seems to be like one of many things, and who knows if it becomes too difficult, they may just take their toys and go home. I would suspect that if he gets, I differ a bit with Brian. I bet the intelligence keeps flowing. And I had said in my remarks, I wonder if the US will allow Ukrainians to use at least European money if we're not supplying this anymore to purchase the ATACMS and other missile systems they need to protect big cities, because that would be important, and the Ukrainians could keep going, I think, nicely with some of that, and then with some of the drone technology, and then this porcupine strategy that the Europeans have talked about with Ukraine. In terms of Renata's question, just quickly, yeah, our focus has been on leaders, partly because these leaders, seem to really put themselves front and center with big personalities and big statements. I'm not confident within Russian politics right now that there are a lot of sort of interest groups that are pressuring Putin that are successful. One would like to think that people will not go on forever with this high number of casualties. And if we think back to the Afghan war, obviously Soviet citizens got very annoyed by that, but that's not the thing that brought down the Soviet Union. It was one of many things. So given all of the other tools that Putin has used to kind of maintain himself in power, in addition to coercion and propaganda, I'm not sure that there's there's big pressure on him to end the war. Probably on the contrary, I know from my contacts in Russia that there's a lot of money being made by his preferred oligarchs in the defense industry and aluminum and things like that. Unfortunately, I think whoever said earlier they can go on and they will go on, I think that's right. He thinks he's winning. We don't think he's winning, but he thinks he's winning.
All right, we're down to we have like 5 minutes left at this point. There's too many questions that we're not going to be able to get to answer to in the Q&A. Thanks, people, for adding them here. I thought I would go to Emma and Olga quickly on, and if I can stress quickly, on this question about U.S.-Ukrainian relations in the aftermath of a potential peace deal. Olga, you had mentioned earlier on that like Zelensky floated the minerals deal idea, as a way, I think, of trying. You brought up a couple of reasons, but I think also this just idea to sort of like anchoring the U.S. a little bit in Ukraine. Could either of you speak from your differing perspectives on how you foresee U.S.-Ukrainian relations if we do get to some sort of ceasefire, if we do get to some sort of peace deal, evolving both in terms of like either in terms of this mineral deal, like will this work, or are we likely to go, or if you want to go beyond that and get a sense of like what is the U.S. investment likely to be at this point? I think we're all pretty clear that European investment will be there, but what are you thinking at this particular moment in time? And like no more than 2 minutes each. Olga, Emma, you want to go first? Okay.
Sure. Yeah. So two things. I mean, one, I think I can sum up the U.S.-Ukrainian relationship if a deal is achieved. I mean, I don't think it's going to be significant, right? I think it's going to be pretty hands-off. Ukraine will get lumped in with Europe, and that's sort of it, at least in this administration. I do want to comment just very briefly on the minerals deal, because actually, to the last question, I think this is an absolutely fascinating case of the sort of sub-state or below leader contestation over some of these issues, right? The mineral deal, as Olga said, originated as an idea in Kyiv, but also in the House in DC, congressional Republicans saying, hey, this is a way that we can persuade Trump to keep up support for Ukraine. And then the administration gets hold of it and turns it into something completely different. So these dynamics are there. And it's not that everyone in DC is suddenly of one mind, but the administration seems to be fairly focused on where they want to go with this. And again, I think they see Ukraine as fairly insignificant in the grand scheme of things, whether that is correct or not. That's how they see it. And so I think that's what Ukrainian-US relationship would look like after the deal or not.
Olga?
I'm not going to comment on whether or not Americans see Ukraine as insignificant. Emma, I'm going to take your word for that. So I think this is fascinating. Yes, this mineral deal. I'm going to just remind you, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba, was presenting 2 weeks ago. No, gosh, time flies really quickly these days. Probably a month ago in London, and he reminded everyone that actually there's already a deal in place for these minerals with the EU, but no one's talking about it. So that's an interesting thing to keep in there. There's only one set of minerals, right? It's in the same territory that already is under a deal. But I think I don't think Ukraine is insignificant. If there is a deal, if America is able to secure some kind of cessation to violence, which will be, of course, extremely welcome by the Ukrainian population, there is a lot of money to be made in reconstruction. We know that Chinese actors are very interested in this. There is a lot of money to be made, far more than the 500+ billion that is estimated that it will take. Now, on top of that, not only does Ukraine have these precious metals, it also has, an abundance of black earth. It has human capital, highly educated population that is capable of loads of things. So I think, and if you recall, President Zelensky was a little bit more libertarian than he was even simply liberal back in the day. And his approach to the free market is pretty wild. So I don't know if that has sustained over time because he has had other matters to attend to. But he was very much willing to have foreign business partners in Ukraine, helping Ukraine develop further. And I think the US stands, and I'm very confident there are individuals in the Trump administration. They want to push a deal to their best, for themselves to be the best possible deal and try to push what they think is a weaker actor. But they know there's a lot of money to be made working in Ukraine. So I think that relationship, in fact, could get a great deal stronger, if not much more complicated and unequal and balanced.
Okay, thank you on this. I think it should be clear to the audience now. We could talk about this for another 2 hours and not run out of things to say, but we are extremely grateful to our panelists who all, I will add, agreed to join us on very short notice to address a topic that is on which they all have great expertise, but which has also been changing by the moment. And so we are extremely grateful for them taking the time to share their insights with us, even if we are leaving in just as confused fashion about what happens. Is that's the world. That's not the end. That's not the experts. And thank you so much for joining us here today. I want to thank everybody who joined us today, took some time during your day to join us with this. As Alex said, this has been the 9th year that we've been doing this. It's been a great pleasure to have all of you here today with us. I also want to take a moment to thank Alex for my co-organizer from this for many, many years over at the Harriman Institute. I want to thank Renata, who is the postdoc who, as Alex mentioned earlier, who has been helping us with this, organizing this seminar. I want to thank Sasha Spadalnik, who is the program administrator of the Jordan Center, who is always at these seminars behind the scenes beforehand. I'd like to thank the Harriman Institute for their support as well. And we'd also like to close by thanking the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which has generously supported this series for many years that we've been doing this. Thank you all for joining us here today, and there'll be much more to say about this in the future, and we'll keep everybody in mind. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks.